Welcome everyone to our episode 65 of our podcast, Cultivating a New Generation. In today's episode, we are going to talk about the psychobiology of resilience. And to talk about this topic, I am going to use as a reference the article of Feather from 2009, Psychobiology and Molecular Genetics of Resilience in Nature Reviews, Neuroscience, in the volume 10. So we are going to go deep into the science of resilience, what is resilience, and what is the research that has begun in this stage of knowing how genetics, epigenetics, and the molecular aspects of this phenomena is giving you a lot of strength, stamina, and withstand for you to cope with everyday stimuli and, of course, mainly with stress. So, recent research has begun to identify environmental, genetic, and epigenetic and neural mechanisms that underlie resilience, and has shown that resilience is mediated by adaptive changes in several neural circuits involving numerous neurotransmitters and molecular pathways. These changes shape the functioning of the neural circuits and regulate the reward, fear, emotion, reactivity, and social behavior, which together are thought to mediate a successful coping with stress. Resilience refers to a person's ability to adapt successfully to acute stress, trauma, or more chronic forms of adversity. A resilient individual has thus been tested by adversity and continues to demonstrate adaptive psychological and physiological stress responses, or psychobiological allostasis. So what is the science telling us? This is how we face adversity and how every time we have a struggle, we cope with the stress, or we even have a trauma in our childhood experiences or in any point in our lives, we are developing an adaptive mechanisms to cope with that stress, and we are creating more resilience. We are elevating the threshold that our body can permeate in order of the molecules, neurotransmitters, and hormones that are going to be released during these emotional traumas, and of course, in facing stress. That doesn't mean that it won't damage in certain aspects your emotional regulation. It just means that resilience is also facing these kind of challenges in spite of the kind of struggles that you are dealing with. The study of resilience or stress resistance originated in the 1970s with a group of researchers directed in their attention to the investigation of children capable of progressing through normal development despite exposure to significant adversity. For many years, research focused on identifying the psychological determinants of stress resistance, such as positive emotions, the capacity for self-regulation, social competence with peers, and a close bond with a primary caregiver, among other factors. Findings from recent studies suggest that genetic influences on biological responses, such as the neural responses to affective stimuli measured with brain imaging, are larger than genetic influences on complex behavioral responses. So what is happening this? The affective stimuli that we are receiving is stronger in terms of developing a neural architecture that is going to support Resilience. Examining stress responses at multiple phenotypic levels, which are the ones that are reflected in our body, and physiological responses, including not only behavioral and psychological measurements, but also measurements in neurochemical, neuroendocrine, and neural systems, could thus help to delineate an integrative model of resilience. The use of active coping strategies such as problem solving and planning has been linked to improved well-being and a greater capacity to handle stressful situations in diverse populations, ranging from trauma exposed to medically ill individuals. Active coping with stress requires an individual to face their fears, and resilient individuals exhibit lower levels of denial, avoidant coping behavior, and behavioral disengagement. So what we are reflecting on this kind of scientific evidence is that the more we have an active coping actions towards what is happening in our lives, instead of neglecting the things that are happening or being avoidant in terms of having apathy to deal with the things, is going to create more resilience and is going to activate the neural mechanisms and the physiological responses to cope much better with stress situations, which is something that many of us and many people have also mistakenly going towards the apathic behavior or the denial situations. And engaging in those things is just going to make you more vulnerable towards the disruption of the stress that is causing in your system, in addition of giving for your body a different kind of set of responses, which is going to be feeding the loops of rumination and creating more anxiety and depression. Resilient individuals are also characterized by dispositional optimism and high positive emotionality. Positive emotions promote adaptive coping and openness to social support, and are associated with greater flexibility of thinking and exploration, a broadened focus of attention, and decreased autonomic activity. Resilience has been linked to being able to perceive stressful events in less threatening ways, promoting adaptive coping strategies. So it is not how you are thinking that stress is affecting you. It is the way you are responding. It is the way you are planning to get out from that situation. And it is also trying to detach from the emotions and seeing the things as with a different perspective, with a more positive perspective, that nothing is permanent and this is going to pass also. And you can find something positive in amidst the chaos or amidst the storm. Corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, is released by the hypothalamus in response to stress, leading to the activation of the HPA axis and the release of cortisol. This hypothalamic axis is going to activate all of the responses throughout the vagus nerve and is going to prime your body towards a threatening response, also activating the sympathetic nervous system, causing you to diminish and lower the functions of the autonomic nervous system, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. Early life stress has been linked to chronically high levels of this hormone, CRH, the corticotropin hormone, in human and animal studies. Although the short-term actions of cortisol are protective, just listen to this. Short-term actions of cortisol are protective and they promote adaptation. So small dosages of stress, which is the good stress, is good for us and it's going to allow us to be in a state of being protected and also promoting an adaptive ability. Sustained exposure to abnormally high levels of cortisol, which is chronic stress, can be harmful, leading to hypertension, immunosuppression, cardiovascular disease, and other health problems that we already know that are going to be triggered. In several animal models and in some human studies, resilience is associated with rapid activation of the stress response and its efficient termination. Resilience is associated with the capacity to constrain stress-induced increases in CRH and cortisol through an elaborate negative feedback system involving optimal functions and balance of glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid receptors. That's why when we see nature lessons and animal lessons of how they cope with the stress, after they have a stressful event or even a fight among the same animals, they have some time to release the stress in terms of moving their wings, in terms of breathing more deeply and showing that they are doing something, moving their bodies so that they can release stress. All of those are the lessons that we should pick in terms of how to cope better with the stress. So after having an episode of any kind of struggle or stressful situation, instead of neglecting the episode, neglecting the stress, just find a way to walk outside for just 10 to 15 minutes, or if you can't in that moment, allow yourself to have in the afternoon a session of exercise so that you can start decompressing, unwinding, and detoxifying all the stressful hormones and allowing this balance between the glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid receptors, which are going to prime also other neurons and hormones, neurotransmitters and hormones. Stress has also led to release of noradrenaline from brainstem nuclei, most importantly from the locus coeruleus. The result is increased noradrenergic stimulation of numerous forebrain areas implicated in emotional behavior, such as the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. Unchecked chronic hyperresponsiveness of the locus coeruleus noradrenergic system is associated with anxiety disorders and cardiovascular problems. Why? Because they are priming most of the regions that are coping with emotional regulation. That's why you have those anxiety disorder. And also that's why those coping physiological mechanisms are not regulating the cardiovascular response. And also you have a blockade of beta adrenergic receptors in the amygdala that can oppose with the development of aversive memories in animals and in humans. This suggests that reduced responsiveness of the locus coeruleus noradrenergic system could promote resilience. Serotonin neurons project widely in the brain. Acute stress is associated with increased serotonin turnover in several brain regions, including the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. That's why whenever you have also an episode of stress, probably not in the immediate moment, but some hours after you feel sad, and you can enter an episode of depression. Serotonin modulates neural responses to stress with both anxiogenic and anxiolytic effects, depending on the brain region and receptor subtype involved. Serotonin function is also closely linked to mood regulation. That's why we have a hard time regulating our mood whenever we have these kinds of episodes of stress. And that's why integrating an exercise release technique so that you can just get out from that ruminative system and allow your body to receive a different kind of signals is going to allow you to have a balance in terms of the neurotransmitters that are going to activate a more resilient response. Dopamine neurons are activated in response to reward or the expectation of reward and generally are inhibited by aversive stimuli, as we are going to discuss further. Dopamine signaling facilitates fear extinction, but its role in resilience is still unclear. So we just know that dopamine is going to activate this reward system and is going to allow stress and fear extinction to detoxify faster, in addition to allowing ourselves to be more motivated to take action, which is what we want in these kinds of situations. Another neuropeptide that is involved in this all molecular magical system of resilience is called NPY, and this neuropeptide that is widely distributed in the brain has also anxiolytic-like effects in rodents, and it is thought to enhance cognition under stressful conditions. So you are learning from the event, you are finding the meaning, and you are finding a way to get out and start doing a more active response. NPY also counteracts the anxiogenic effects of CRH in the amygdala, in the hippocampus, in the hypothalamus, and the locus coeruleus. And resilience might involve maintaining a balance between NPY and the corticotropin hormone levels during stress. In a study of the special forces soldiers who are considered to be highly stress resilient, higher NPY levels during rigorous military training were associated with better performance. Another study found that higher plasma of NPY levels in combat-exposed veterans without PTSD, and they were able to deal better than those that didn't have PTSD. These findings in humans are consistent with recent studies in rats in animals. Central administration of NPY in rats inhibits the development and promotes the extinction of fear conditioning, with NPY antagonists exerting the opposite actions. These effects are mediated, at least in part, by the amygdala. BDNF is another neurotrophic factor that is derived from the brain and is allowing you to protect your neurons and create new ones. Is an important nerve growth factor that is expressed at high levels in the brain. Is best known for its role in rodent models and in promoting the functioning of adult hippocampus, including the survival of newly born granule cell neurons throughout adult life. And this BDNF is released whenever you engage in a session of exercise. That's why it is recommended that after you have this kind of stressful event or a trauma situation, you have some time to find and do some exercise. Even if you don't feel like it, trying to force yourself a little bit from those situations is what is going to allow you to have a negative feedback in terms of the response towards stress, because you are going to signal your body that you are recovering, and you are going to allow the release of many of these toxic chemicals. Similar findings have been observed in humans, that the hippocampus was examined after they were dead. However, BDNF exerts a very different effect in other brain regions. Chronic stress increases this BDNF expression in the rodent nucleus accumbens, and this has been linked to pro-depression-like effects in several behavioral assays, which it is related to stress. But if you activate BDNF through exercise, that's a different pathway, and that's a different response. Interestingly, this induction of BDNF is causally related to the degree to which rodents are vulnerable versus resilient to the deleterious effects of stress. For example, passive coping, which is what I was mentioning. It is not the same to be passive and apathy and have apathy or being apathetic towards these kind of stressful events than designing a new way to cope with this stress and activating a session of exercise that is going to move all of those pool chemicals that you are building up inside of you, and is going to allow you to have an active response. With these subjects that have a passive coping, they show no increase in BDNF levels in terms of not helping them to get out from this kind of situations. On the other side, the individuals that perform some active coping mechanisms, they didn't increase the levels of BDNF that were having the deleterious effects in the neural circuits. So they were not activating the depression or anxiety response. Humans with depression also show increased BDNF levels in the nucleus accumbens, which highlights the very different effects exerted by DNF in different neural circuits. And it all depends on whether you are an active coping mechanism or a passive active mechanism. And you choose that. You are the only one that is going to choose to be in a social avoidance situation, in a passive coping mechanism, or just neglecting what is happening to you. If you allow those kind of responses, what you are doing is just prolonging the effect of stress and creating more ruminative behaviors. Now, what happens in terms of the genetics of this kind of phenomena of resilience? There are complex interactions between an individual's genetic makeup and his or her particular history of exposure to environmental stressors that determine the degree of adaptability. And we have known that because we have seen how some people are much better to cope and adapt towards stressful situations than others. But that doesn't mean that you cannot now have a different environment and a different kind of active mechanism in order to epigenetically change these kind of genes and turn them on. That's what we are going to see in this kind of research. So these responses are not just fixated by your genetics. So you can start having a more neural circuitry involved in stress responses with the environment that you are designing. What are the gene and gene interactions in terms of the environment? Well, recent research and studies have begun to yield evidence of gene and gene environment interactions underlying inter-individual variability in stress responses. Findings include the monoamine oxidase gene interaction that affects endocrine responses to a psychological challenge. This kind of peptide and enzyme that is going to be produced, we are going to allow many of the coping mechanisms in terms of protecting the limbic reactivity to unpleasant stimuli in healthy subjects. So whenever you have an environment that is healthier and you start adding activities and certain things so that you can cope actively with stress, you are going to turn on many of these genes and are going to rewire your system so that you can have a different response. Other researchers reported that gene-environment interactions influence the risk for depression in maltreated children. Social support seems to mitigate the effects of short allele in terms of the genetics of many of the genes that are going to release serotonin and also this monoamine oxidase and BDNF as well. So social interaction is key to allow us to regulate the stress. That's why when we were in those 2 years of not having too much social interaction or not having at all social interaction, we were so damaged because many of these environmental factors affected the type of resilience that we could create. And that's why it was a very good strategy to design even Zoom interactions, to talk, to have some contact, and to allow ourselves to get out from the narrative that was going to be just ruminative because we didn't have that social exposure. Functional variants of the brain mineralocorticoid and glucocorticoid receptors genes, which are respectively involved in setting the threshold and regulating the termination of the HPA axis in response to stress, have also been identified in humans. So we have the power of resetting the system and changing the receptor genes in terms of allowing a much better response and a much higher threshold to regulate the termination of stress response. The demonstration that resilient and vulnerable responses to stress are dramatically distinct in populations of genetically identical mice with highly controlled environment histories, which raises the possibility that a third type of mechanism, which is epigenetics, could be involved. The hypothesis is that stochastic epigenetic changes, stochastic means random epigenetic changes that occur during brain development, are an additional means by which behavioral variability is generated in individuals, better preparing the species for a host of possible environmental challenges. So the more we prepare our children to cope with different kinds of stressful situations and allow them to face also these kind of situations and solve them by themselves, of course, supervising or just being as a guide, but not resolving the problems, that's how we are going to start priming the environmental factors in their psyche and inside of all the molecular pathways that are going to allow them in adult stages to face much better the reality of life and also to cope with the stress. So what are the psychosocial factors and possible neurobiological associated traits with resilience? Pay attention to this because this is the most important information of this whole research. Facing fears and active coping. That's one of the psychosocial factors that is going to neurobiologically shape and change your brain to cope much better with stress is going to regulate the fight and flight response from the HPA axis and allowing your body to find balance. What are the things that you can do to activate this kind of active coping? Physical exercise can be viewed as a form of active coping and has positive effects on mood because we are releasing a different kind of profile in terms of the chemistry of our body. And that attenuates stress responses and is thought to promote neurogenesis because you release BDNF, but from another source. Optimism and positive emotions. That's the second factor that is going to allow the shaping of their resilience response and the stressful response. Positive emotions might contribute to healthier cognitive responses of learning from these kind of situations. And they are going to regulate the mesolimbic dopamine pathways. So the pathways of your emotional brain to have a more rewarding response and to be stress resistant in individuals that have shown optimistic when faced with any kind of trauma. Cognitive reappraisal, positive reframing, and acceptance. What is this? Learning how to shift your mind and your perception in order to see the things that are happening to you from a different angle, from an angle of learning from the situation, from finding the meaning of the situation, and from taking all these negative stimuli to rewire, to increase, and to allow yourself to develop a new threshold of a stressful response. Resilient individuals might be better at reappraisal or might use this reappraisal system more frequently. So these neurobiological mechanisms that underlie of these processes include memory suppression, memory consolidation, and cognitive control of emotion. So how we learn from the situations that are stressful, how we see them, and how we first accept them is the most important thing in this kind of remodeling of your response to stress. Social competence and social support, what we have mentioned before. Having a social network, having people to talk about the situation, and even doing something to activate this oxytocin reward response, which is going to be activated by the social interaction, is going to create a much better response toward fears and is going to disrupt the mechanisms of the rumination and stressful situation in terms of your molecular chemistry. Purpose in life, a moral compass, meaning, and spirituality. Those are the last characteristics that are going to shape the response of resilience and allow you to cope much better with stress. The sense of purpose, having an internal set of values, of beliefs about the right and wrong, about the characteristics of yourself, knowing yourself, and having a spiritual background, practices that can be just meditating, that can be just being in contact with your inner voice or with that higher presence, whatever the religion that you are choosing, or even if you don't have any religion and you just find in spiritual techniques the connection with that higher source and higher self, is going to allow you to face much better the trauma and finding the meaning, because you know that you are just a spot in the universe. You are just the makeup of the universe, but there is a higher power that is going to help you, and that it is always guiding you so that you can find yourself in a much better situation. So this has been proven in brain imaging studies, and they have identified that there are many, many neural pathways that are going to be enlightened by this kind of spiritual response. So, in summary, what do you have to do in terms of priming your resilience, boosting the response, and coping with stress? You will have stress in life. It can be good stress if you allow the response to be shorter, and it can be protective, and it will even allow your threshold to go up. But maintaining a passive behavior towards the stressful situations is just going to increase the time, and is just going to increase the damage that you are provoking yourself in terms of expanding the duration of the stressful situation. And you should do exercise. You should have a social support system. You should start writing your own values, start writing your own rituals and routines of spiritual practices so that you can have them ready whenever you face any kind of traumatic situation of coping with the stressful events. Thank you very much for paying attention. If you like this episode, if it allowed you and gave you a lot of information in terms of these molecular and epigenetic mechanisms of resilience, help me to share this information with more people that I know that they need techniques and practical tips to cope with stress. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, and please subscribe to the channel and give me your comments about the information that I'm sharing. Thank you. Bye.